Hey everybody. I hope this is working. Uh, this is going to be the oral component to the Torget review of chapter 1 for this week. And I'm just going to briefly highlight some points. It's a repetition of what I'm going to post. But some students like the oral when I talk about this. Some students like reading it. Some students like both. So given my basic philosophy of online is too much communication is better than too little, I'm going to forge ahead. So the Torget book is one of the most important books written about something that we often take for granted, and that's the transition of Texas from a Spanish colony, which is in terrible shape because the Spanish have largely ignored it, to a US slave state. I think all too often we just take that for granted, that of course Texas would become part of the slaveholding South. It's just kind of a given. Well, what Torget does, he talks about that process. He doesn't take it for granted. He examines it and he examines how it happens. And think for a second, think how profound a change that is. That Texas transforms from a Spanish colony, a different society, a different language, a different religion, a different set of laws, a different governing authority, a different orientation, to a US slaveholding state. It's pretty amazing. And it happens between 1821, when Spain's kicked out of Texas, and Texas becomes Mexico. So it happens between the late 18 teens and 1845 when the Texas becomes part of the U.S. So he wants to break down what happens. And 2 points I want to make at the beginning. There are two sections of this chapter that you don't have to read for this week. The first is the rebellion section, which begins on the middle of page 29. And the second section is a vast and noiseless desert section, which begins on page 45 and goes to the end of the chapter. Uh, I think I'll have you read the rebellion section next week. I'm just going to lecture on the vast and noiseless desert section in my podcast. So you don't have to read those for the quiz, unless, of course, you're interested in the story. Then I'm not going to stop you from reading it. Also, anything that I hit with an asterisk, I expect you to know for the quiz or the midterm. So I'm giving you fair warning. And I especially do that for dates, which, as I've said many times, this is what often kills history for students, the details that drive everybody mad. To be honest with you, I can't even remember all the details myself. But when there's a detail that I want you to know, expect you to know, I will indicate that to you and signal. I'm not going to try to trick you, which I think is stupid and terrible teaching. Okay, so let's get to the reading now. Take a brief look at the map that starts chapter 1. It's a terrific map of a story that you should be familiar with by now, having taken the quiz. I guess you have until tomorrow to take the quiz. It has a good map of what Spanish Texas really consisted of, which is what today is Central and East Texas. The Nueces River being the southern border of Texas from the Spanish point of view, not the Rio Grande. And let me give you a verbal star here. Uh, I will expect you to know that from the Spanish and Mexican point of view, the Nueces River is the southern border of Texas, not the Rio Grande River. There's a whole story to how the Rio Grande becomes the southern border of Texas, which I'm going to develop. Okay, so the book starts with a flood in San Antonio, and it talks about Antonio Martinez, the Spanish governor of Texas. And really, that section just talks about what a mess Spanish Texas is, especially its capital city, its largest city by far, San Antonio is. And by 1819, just 2 years before the Spanish are kicked out of Texas. And it underlines this point that I'm trying to make, that although the Spanish left a permanent mark on Texas, which permeates Texas to this very day and helps shape the character of Texas. At the same time, the Spanish were basically indifferent to Texas. Uh, Mexico City was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere in 1819, and it might have been the largest city on Earth. But think about San Antonio. There's only like 2,000 people or so in San Antonio. So the Spanish did leave their mark on Texas, but they never really populated this area because there was no mineral wealth. It was too tough, too far from Mexico City, all these things I've talked about a lot. So what Torget starts his book with a good description of just what a mess and how weak San Antonio is, Spanish Texas is, um, just on the eve of the Mexican Revolution, when Texas will transfer from Spanish authority to Mexican authority. Um, Big point that I want to make, two big points. One, that the only Spanish settlements that survive are San Antonio, Nacogdoches, and Goliad. That's something I'm going to want you to know. So this, again, it just shows the Spanish were not super successful in populating Texas. And here's the other point, which I think is as important, that because there are very few Tejanos, or people of Spanish descent in Texas, uh, it's very vulnerable to attack when the United States becomes the border of Texas, which is in 1803. In 1803, the US purchases Louisiana, and Spanish Texas gains a new neighbor, a very powerful neighbor, a very ambitious neighbor, the United States, and a very expansionist neighbor. So one of the bigger points, and the reason I'm stressing this about the lack of the big population in Spanish Texas, is that it leaves the Spanish failure to populate Texas leaves Texas very vulnerable to being incorporated into the United States, which happens in 1845. Now, of course, when that happens, Texas is Mexico, but Mexico has to deal with the legacy of the Spanish failure to populate this region. And so this becomes Texas's fate and becomes kind of Mexico's tragedy, that they win a territory, Texas, that at the same time is extremely vulnerable to US encroachment, because the Spanish never built a big population in Texas.